Secretary of State Mike Pompeo will soon address the volatile situation in the Middle East. He's expected to defend the Trump administration's decision to launch a deadly airstrike that killed one of Iran's top military leaders. So for more on this, let's bring in CBS News State Department and Foreign Affairs reporter Christina Ruffini. She's joining us now from Washington at the State Department. So, Christina, what's the latest on this? The strike was last week. Iran has threatened retaliation. The U.S. has threatened more retaliation if that happens. The Trump administration says it wants to de-escalate, but officials have they laid out any kind of strategy to accomplish that? Any kind of diplomatic strategy?
Not that we've seen so far. When we asked U.S. officials at the end of last week, senior U.S. officials, what is the diplomatic strategy? Where do we go from here? You say you want to de-escalate. How are you going to accomplish that? They said essentially, well, Iran knows how to get a hold of us. Iran knows how to reach us. And there were reports that after the strike against Soleimani, remember, the U.S. does not have diplomatic relations with Iran. So the Swiss are a protecting power. So the Swiss ambassador was summoned to meet with the Iranians. And there were reports he carried with him a letter from Pompeo that the Iranians then said was considered very rude. And then the latest is that Elizabeth Palmer, CBS's Elizabeth Palmer, talked to Iranian Foreign Minister Zarif, and he said he's not getting a visa to come to the UN this Friday as expected. So the UN is that big building in New York where diplomats do the diplomat thing. So if they were going to talk about it or work it out, that might have been a good venue to start. But I think at this point it's too early, and the two sides are not ready to talk. So what we're hearing is more rhetoric and more doubling down on if you hit us, we're going to hit you back, and vice versa.
Well, speaking of that, we've learned a little bit more about the nature of what that might be. Taking a closer look at Iran's response, Supreme Leader Khamenei says that he wants Iranian forces to directly attack U.S. targets as opposed to relying on proxy groups, which was part of the speculation initially, that one of the things that we were talking about that is a possibility. So how significant is it that he said he wants Iranian forces to do the work?
It's a big deal because for years Iran has acted or kind of hid behind this facade of, oh, it wasn't us, it was those guys. But they've used proxy groups that they have just one or two steps removal from plausible or unplausible deniability, depending on whether you believe them or not, to say that they were not directly going after forces like the United States or the Saudis. Now they've said the gloves are off, they're not hiding behind anyone, and they're threatening direct retaliation, which is an escalation that we haven't seen before.
All right, as you referenced the interview that Liz Palmer did with Javad Zarif, in which he told her that the U.S. has denied him a visa for meetings at the United Nations this week. Why would he want to come here, and why is that significant?
He wants to come here because he wants to make his case not only to the international community, but to the American media. And that's why he sat down with Western outlets overseas. He talked to Elizabeth Palmer, he talked to CNN, he talked to NPR, because he wants to make his case just as the Secretary of State is making his case. Now, you can argue whether or not denying him a visa to come here is an astute move or is kind of playing into their hands and saying it's just a petty way of punishing someone who can just as easily, even Robert O'Brien, the National Security Advisor this morning, said, well, he can just telephone into the telephone conference. So, it's inconvenient. It's not really making one difference one way or the other. And the Iranians are saying it's petty, and the U.S. is saying, well, we just didn't have time to get to your visa because there's been a lot going on.
All right, finally, Christina, this one may be a tougher one to answer. So the president tweeted out that he had a number of targets of Iranian interest, including cultural sites that the U.S. is willing to go after, which is a war crime. And then we heard from the defense secretary saying that is not the case at all. And then we heard from the president saying that is absolutely the case. What is going on here? What is the possibles, if there is a strategy? What are you hearing about even reaction to what the president had to say versus what the Pentagon is saying?
So the president said twice, including on Air Force One, they hit our people. We're not allowed to go after their cultural sites. That's ridiculous. We're not going to play by those games. However, yesterday we heard from Secretary Esper and other defense officials saying we're going to abide by the international laws of engagement. These are civilian sites with no military value. We wouldn't go after that. We're only going to, we're going to go after military sites of strategic value to the Iranian and abide by the laws of engagement. This is important because the U.S. has a long history of going out of its way to try to protect the cultural heritage of the countries, even they're at war with. We also, the movie The Monuments Men, right, all the way back to World War II, they actually, advisors circled maps for the generals when they were doing the campaign of Italy that highlighted the cultural sites and said, if you can, please don't hit these sites. One of the generals complained it was like trying to have a war in a museum. But the reason you do that is twofold. First of all, it's respectful, it's unnecessary, and these cultural heritage sites, they belong to the world. They belong to to everyone. They're part of our shared cultural heritage. The other issue is you don't want to give your enemy a propaganda tool. You don't want to give them pictures of sites that are very important to the domestic population and say, look what the Americans are doing. They're erasing your history, and now they're going after their future. So it's tactically smart, and it's also, it helps you win the war of hearts and minds, which the Secretary of State and the State Department and the administration have said they support the Iranian people. They've always supported the Iranian people. It's the regime they disagree with, and going after cultural sites would really undercut that argument.
Indeed. Christina, thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.